Hey, welcome to High Resolution. My name is Bobby Ghoshal.
And I'm Jared Arandu.
We're sitting down with 25 masters of the design industry, and we've been learning a lot for the past few weeks. We hope you've been loving these episodes. Today's guest is amazing. We're so excited to have him on board. We're going to talk about how the best companies in the world approach, communicate, and deploy design every single day.
In this episode, we're speaking with Daniel Burka. Daniel is a design partner at GB. He's going to focus on how to build bridges at your company to help elevate design, how design is actually a scientific method, and the thinking behind the design sprint.
And we're going to get into this episode after this quick partner message, so stick around.
Thanks to Squarespace for their support. Whether you need a domain, a website, or an online store, make your next move with Squarespace. Visit squarespace.com and enter the code HIGHRESOLUTION, one word, for 10% off your first purchase. Daniel, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Cool. All right. So first question, what's one thing about design that's clear to you that you feel is not so clear to other people?
So I get this unique perspective where I'm working with a lot of different companies at once. And I think one of the things that I've started noticing, more and more clearly as time has gone on is how little of design is done in Sketch or Photoshop or even in code, and how much of design is done by figuring out relationships within your company and understanding the core business of kind of like, why does your business exist? If designers can understand these things and understand the pressures, the people they work with are under, and where decisions are making from elsewhere, decisions are coming from elsewhere in the organization, they're much more likely to be successful with their actual, what they think of as design work.
So what I like about that, actually, this might be a weird place to go to next, but you talked about relationships, so I completely agree with you on the software side. The relationship side, I think that tends to escape the modes of operation for designers day to day, because you talk about politics a lot, right? Like a lot of design is just politicking, right? Creating the relationships with the right people inside of the company. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So first of all, what does politicking mean? And then what does that mean for how designers should operate day to day inside of the company?
A big piece of when I talk about politics, obviously kind of lowercase p politics, but a big piece of the politics to me is understanding kind of what the motivations for other people in your business are, right? If you go and talk to your CTO or your sales team or the customer service team and you ask them what keeps you up at night, you'll hear all these things that don't sound typically like design problems, but they're very design problems, right? And these are all the reasons why when you work in Sketch or Photoshop and you come up with something brilliant and you bring it to a meeting and you want to express your brilliance, it's why your ideas get shot down. It's not because people looked at it and empirically could tell your design sucked. It's because they have other priorities. They have other things going on. And if your design doesn't speak to those priorities, you're going to end up doing a lot of dead-end design work. So what I encourage designers to do is to literally go ask that question. Go and sit with your head of sales and say, hey, you may not know what I do, that's fine, but I'm much more interested in what you do. What does your team do? What stresses you out? What are your priorities for the next quarter? You can ask it in really concrete terms. What are your OKRs for the next quarter? What are the priorities for your team? And this is very important because it'll inform kind of how decisions are made within your organization and make sure that you're actually working on the right types of design at the right time.
So this is in lieu of going to someone with a design and saying, what do you think of this? This is about, tell me about yourself. This is more about that. Very
much so. And I think the best designers I know did that legwork 6 months ago. And now when they bring the designs, to somebody, it's not like a shock to anybody, and they can speak to those concerns. Because by the time you realize that you're running into a wall, it's too late to go and do that legwork of creating the relationships you need to create and gathering knowledge you need to gather in order to kind of ship something successful. It's really frustrating to me listening to designers complain. They're always like, oh, no one listens to me, or I made this great thing and no one cares. And you're like, they want to throw another team under the bus of it's suddenly their fault. And you're like, you're just not a good designer because you didn't do the work. All that other stuff outside of Sketch and Photoshop and code, that's design. If you're not doing it, you're only a 1/3 designer. Like, no wonder you're frustrated.
So what percentage of a designer's job is, say, away from a computer?
Probably 2/3.
2/3.
Yeah, I mean, to pull a statistic out of my butt.
That's amazing.
Sure.
Yeah, in your experience, anecdotal statistics, sure, why
How much
not?
time do you spend in meetings? How much time do you spend in,
I'm not disagreeing.
prioritizing stuff?
I completely agree. Yeah.
All of that's design.
Yeah.
And a lot of designers get frustrated because they feel like they don't get enough time to design.
Yeah.
And I get it. I feel that way too. I wish I'd have more time to spend in Sketch and, creating interfaces. But you have to remember that all these other things are your job too.
Yeah.
Well, outside of building these relationships with these stakeholders, these non-designers, what's something else a designer can do to start showing the value that they can actually add to a different team?
So I think one of the things designers can do to show value, there are kind of two things. One is to think about how you express the value of what you're doing, right? If you just talk about it in terms of aesthetics or this is better, right? Like these kind of broad generalities, you're not going to be very successful. I think we can take some lessons from product management this way. Product's quite good at quantifying what they do. They're quite good at saying, like, we're going to increase the metrics on the conversion funnel from 3% to 7%. Like, that's really measurable. It's a good goal. Designers say the same thing, but we say it in a much more emotional way. Like, we want to make users happier when they come through sign up. Right? And both these things have a lot of value. I think Julie Zhu wrote a really good post on how can PMs work with designers and how can designers work with engineers, this kind of how can we all understand each other. I think it's worth considering kind of how people phrase kind of the value of what they're doing and think of ways that are more business driven. If you're in a capitalistic business, to think about how to express that value to people. Like, hey, we're going to increase sales, we're going to increase conversion, and think of it in a measurable way, but also express it in the designer's way of understanding that users aren't just like, kind of faceless beings that we're hoping will increase things. Like, they're humans, and like this is one of the great values of design, is to kind of humanize the decisions we're making. And the other way to drive a lot of value in a company, I think, this is something I think about a lot, is there's ideas all over your company, right? And so whether you're in engineering or you're in product or you're in customer service or you're the CEO, everyone's got these little inklings of ideas around a business, right? There are, you see this if you go around a company, you have lunch with people like, oh, if only we did X, we'd be really successful. Or what if we tried, Y? What would happen with users? Everyone's really interested in coming up with ideas. Even your finance team is coming up with product ideas. And one of the things that frustrates everybody in your business is that those ideas, these inklings are so loosely formed. They're just being verbalized. Maybe somebody made a doc about it. But when I describe an inkling to you and you perceive it, we're actually talking about something different. What you see is not what I'm seeing in my head. And this creates a lot of friction in a business, right? Because, everyone feels like their ideas aren't being heard, or you just don't get my thing. Everyone's been in these meetings where like, no, you just don't understand, right? And I think one of the most valuable things design can do, and one of the things that politically works really well because it embeds you deeply in the organization, is to work with people, everybody in your organization who's coming up with these inklings, and help them give it shape. Design, one of the magic tricks of design is that we can make something appear realistic. Without a lot of work. Design is very good at faking things. So when you come up with an idea, I can be like, Jared, that's such an interesting idea. I think I understand it. Just give me a couple hours. You go and jump into Sketch and prototype it. And what I made is almost certainly not exactly what you had in your head, but now we can talk about it. And now we can improve it and bring it closer to what you were envisioning. And then we can take it to a wider group of people. And now we can all debate it on its merits rather than, all trying to grok this kind of amorphous concept that, somebody came up with. I think that function, it's just one thing designers can do, but I think it's one especially high leverage thing that design is uniquely positioned to do within organizations. And a a lot of successful designers I've seen in organizations are the person who sits in that meeting and doesn't say a whole lot and walks out of the meeting instead of getting all hot and bothered and debating things, and just goes and prototypes kind of what they heard everyone saying. Yeah. And then when they come back to the group, suddenly they're at the center of the room, the center of attention, and they've got this thing now that we can all discuss and kind of unlock the team.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. So in that sense, they become like the intermediary, right? Like between, which is pretty fascinating.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. Yeah.
So one thing I want to touch on there, and like I'm still trying to like develop this question as I say it. You kind of touched on two scenarios. One scenario is, the designer who is in the cafeteria, like the lunch, like wherever, like the team went out, and just hearing these random thoughts pop up, right? And they sit with the finance or the salesperson, explore that a bit, go back, come back, and like start developing an idea, right? Then you have the designer who's in the meeting for an existing project. For the latter group, it makes sense that you would want to go out and do this and come back because this was already prioritized for you or your team. Otherwise, you would not be in that meeting, right? For the former group, this is you kind of like taking this as like on yourself to like go explore this idea, right? So I'm really curious, especially for junior designers, if they see this as an opportunity to like show value, how do they do this? How do they do that lunch route and not come off as if they're not actually focusing on their priorities at their job?
That's a great question. Some of this is, one is like not caring too much. Like it's fine. Like, ask, what is the adage? The ask for forgiveness rather than permission.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, that's a good idea, especially in the tech world. I think you can get away with that without getting slapped down too much. But the other part of it is, if you really want to get buy-in for your idea, is to go back to the first thing I was talking about, which is to understand what the priorities of the business are. If you go and prototype something and you're like, like our car sales, app, the next thing we need is VR, and the finance team came up with this VR idea, and like, look, we prototyped it, and it works great on the gear, and like, you put it on someone's head, like, people might think that's cute, but they're going to be like, screw you, like, this is not going to drive sales, we can't get adoption, there's like 100 reasons not to do that. And then you'll get frustrated because you're like, oh, no one listens to me. And it's like, people are much more likely to listen to you if you're prototyping the ideas that also fall on the prioritization roadmap. And if you're not doing that, like, don't get me wrong, go rogue, like, knock yourself out, but also don't be frustrated when everyone else is, very, very difficult to convince. So you if you think of it, if you're a product manager, a head of product, you're hearing 1,000 ideas, and one of your key functions is to choose which ones are worth exploring. So it's a good idea as a designer to put yourself in their shoes and be like, oh, the head of product's probably the person I'm going to need to convince with this. Is this the kind of thing that he or she is going to, would they consider putting this on their priority list? It's really frustrating to me, and this is good advice, I think, for young designers. It always frustrates me when people put themselves as employees. They think of themselves first as like kind of, oh, I'm just like, somebody who does design. And you sit down with them and they're like, oh, I made this thing. Do you think that's good on the priority list? And you just look at them and you're like, would you put it there? And like, it's like it never occurred to them before. It's like, to really be, a great designer or great employee generally, I think, it's to stop thinking of yourself as just a staff member and like somebody who, I'll just do my best and I'll let somebody else make all the decisions, but to start trying to guess, like, if I was in their shoes, what's the decision I would make?
Put yourself in the driver's seat.
Yeah.
It sounds like, by the way, the prototyping thing, right? Sitting in a boardroom, having a bunch of people around you that aren't designers debate something that they're all seeing a little differently in their minds, and your ability to go back and create, like, manifest something that everyone can look at. Do you see that as the ultimate olive branch to like everyone else in the company? Like, is that like the best that the designer can do for people in a company?
Yeah, you can either call it an olive branch or call it like an underhanded move to gain influence.
Sure.
I like that you phrase it in a nice positive way.
Yeah.
But I think it's one of the sneakiest things you can do that actually is really good for a business. Because people won't, by the time you walk in with that object in your hands, like people get so distracted by the thing that they're not like upset with you for having come up with it, you know? Like, and one of the great things, I found this to be extremely effective, even if this sounds really manipulative. One of the great things is if your CEO or your product person or your head of engineering or somebody above you basically has come up with an idea and it's just an okay idea, but you're like, oh, it's like almost aligned with like kind of where I was thinking about taking things. If you prototype their idea, like I would literally do their idea. Don't just prototype your concept. When I was working with Kevin Rose, for instance, I would always prototype Kevin's idea, and then I'd prototype my idea, which was like related to it. I'd be like, oh, Kevin, here's this great idea. I really liked it. Here it is. But if we change it in these other ways, like this is where we could really go. Yeah. And the genius of it is the leader thinks that's their idea because I guess they had some kernel of it. Yeah. And so it's like this kind of tricky way to bring everyone along and make them feel like they're bought in. Because it's not, Daniel or Jared, coming in and like presenting their idea because people get, their egos get crushed a little bit with this. But if it's, Jim, I took your idea and I ran with it, and look what it looks like if we, make a few adjustments to it. Yeah. Jim's like, all of a sudden, it's you and Jim pushing that idea together. Yeah. It's a very good way to actually get things done.
It's being additive to what they thought was the right move, as opposed to being prescriptive to what you thought was the right
And even if you do something that's radically different from theirs, if you're like, Jim, here's your idea, here's the shortcomings in it, now that we can see it, we can see that it's got shortcomings, we can both agree to this, as long as Jim has the humility to agree to that, and then be like, but here's the other idea. It's still like, oh, we tried this avenue, it wasn't successful, that's fine, at least we tried it. The risk is if you never try people's ideas, they'll always think it was a good idea. Right? Because they're like, that idea is sitting in the back of my head, and I regret that we never tried it. Whereas prototyping is this cheap way to fail quickly, right? It's like, I can see it, now I see the, what's wrong with it, and now I can pivot off to something else, either, an improvement to it or something totally different. Very, very effective.
We're going to talk a lot about function, but I actually want to spend a second on form. What is the right time for designers to focus on the look and feel of a thing?
When I think about form, I heard a quote years and years ago. I think Josh Porter, who's a designer up in Boston, posted this Shaker quote a long time ago, the sect of the Quakers. And they make that really beautiful, really simplistic furniture, right? They're famous for. And there's a Shaker quote that said, don't make anything unless it's necessary. But if it's necessary, don't hesitate to make it beautiful. And that always resonated with me. It's like, that's awesome. Make sure you're designing the right thing. One of the dangers of being a designer is we can make lots of kind of mediocre ideas look attractive. So be careful of not even convincing yourself that something's great just because you slapped a really beautiful gradient on it and a cool name. But fundamentally go and try to validate your idea. And if your idea can't stand up, even if it's just okay looking, not perfect looking, it's probably not that good idea to begin with. So focus on making sure you're doing the right thing. And then I have this... when I think about aesthetics, I often think of it much more in terms of achieving the right objective as opposed to making something that looks good. Designers are very, very fond of thinking that the world needs to be beautiful. And maybe it does. I'm a bit torn on this, to be honest. I'm not sure I've got a clear opinion on it. But functionally, from a capitalist business perspective, when I look at Walmart and it's gray and burgundy and navy blue, and, a big part of me is like, oh, Target looks way better, right? From a graphic design perspective, Target is much more just attractive, right? I mean, the typography is better, the colors are better. But you've got to admit that if you stand on the roof of this building and look around and you saw Walmart, you'd be like, it's 2 miles away, and I'd be like, there's cheap things in that building. Yeah. That is the effect the designers were going for. It's extremely effective. So if your goal is to build credibility or to show that something is affordable, making something beautiful, beautiful in the designer's sense, it isn't always the right thing to do. So I
also
want to be
feels a
careful.
little-
Aesthetics is aesthetics. It's not necessarily beauty. Yeah.
So it's make sure they love it when it's ugly, and then you'll know they'll love it when it's beautiful. Like, is that?
No, that's not quite what
No?
I'm saying. I
Know when
am
to make
saying,
it beautiful.
Well, I'm saying that on the one hand, focus on that you're making the right thing, even if it's just okay looking, right? It's not necessarily ugly, just just
Loosely
functionally
using ugly
it works,
there, yeah.
right? But the second point I'm making is that making something beautiful isn't necessarily even the goal when you're focusing on aesthetics. Like focusing on something that communicates the message you're trying to get across is the message, right? And so, Walmart choosing those colors I think is quite effective.
Yeah.
I'd never describe it as beautiful.
Fair.
And that's true of I worked with we invested in a site that made coupons. One of the designs that we worked with their team on was quite, improved the aesthetics. It looked prettier. Typography was better, the colors were better, spacing was better. In testing, it totally bombed. People did not believe that they could get a deal on this site because it looked too pretty, right? If a site's kind of a bit hacked together, you're much more likely to expect a discount.
Yeah.
It's like the same case with Craigslist. Craigslist tested their
absolutely.
website multiple times, and
It looks like a flea market.
Yeah, and that's the goal.
You wouldn't want to go to a flea market that's perfectly designed. You wouldn't want to go to a farmer's market that looks like Disney World, right? There's something about the grittiness of it that makes you believe in it. So
know when to make it beautiful.
I think focus on the right aesthetic for the right problem is probably, for the right objective, I guess, is probably more specifically what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
Can you expand on the idea that design done right can be a scientific method for a business?
Sure. So this is something I've been thinking about for the last year or so. One of my colleagues, John Zaratsky, said this in a meeting, and I was like, oh my God, that really resonates with me. Why? And I started thinking about it. One of the things you see really commonly in businesses is that there's a lot of uncertainty, right? We think we're headed in the right direction, but if we make this change, how will it affect our user base? How will we, in 6 months' time, will we be able to go out and raise a new venture fund? Technically, is something possible? There's all these questions in businesses, right? And the way that there's kind of a few ways we generally solve them. One, we look into the past and try to figure out, has anyone solved this problem before, or someone run to the situation before, and can we kind of predict what might happen from the past? The problem with solving things that way is that the context has changed, right? So if someone had tried, doing a certain photography application before mobile phones, well, holy shit, like Flickr, for instance, you could look at Flickr solved the problem, but then mobile phones came along and everything changed. So you have to remember that technology changes, society changes. So it's a tricky thing to look to the past to inform our business decisions. The other common way that we solve things is to kind of debate it out. And then, we sit in these stupid meetings where everyone's like, oh, users will do X or users will do Y. And that's always really frustrating because nobody, the longer I've been doing design, I've been designing for 20 years. And all you learn is nobody can really predict what users will do. It's kind of a fool's errand. And so we intellectually, try to figure out a problem. We try to look to the past. We look to other experts kind of thing. So we'll go off, talk to your, advisors about kind of how they've solved something, and they come with their own confirmation bias. Anyway, there's lots of uncertainty in a business, right? And you see this in kind of every team in a company, and we do a lot of talking about it. And I think one of the great values in design is this kind of coming back to this prototyping idea I was talking about earlier, is that if you can take an idea that we're all debating the merits of and prototype it and then go and actually test it with customers, you can create this loop very, very quickly of, had an idea, a thesis is like the scientific method, create an experiment, the prototype, test it with customers. All of a sudden we're going from very low certainty about whether or not we're making the right decision to more certainty that, it's like any small experiment. It's, a pretty small sample set, but, we're generally testing with 5 customers, 10 customers. You can go from having very low certainty to at least some directional certainty about whether or not the idea has any merit. And this, to me, is like this scientific method where instead of just shooting in the dark all the time, investing a lot of effort in these long-form experiments of getting something out in the wild and measuring it, the typical agile method of development, we can create much tighter loops, right? This big loop, 3-4 months of launching something, measuring the metrics on it, trying to do some field analysis with to get more qualitative analysis rather than quant. You can do these things. It takes you months, and it's very, very expensive. Design can be this scientific method that is much more rapid and much more quick little experiments to make sure that we're actually directionally being successful.
Thanks again to Squarespace for supporting this show. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform to get a domain, create a website, or build an online store. They offer domains with SSL certificates and WHOIS privacy that you can seamlessly connect to your Squarespace website or online store. They take care of everything for you. Nowadays, your domain is your online identity. It's the first thing people see when they visit your site. It helps build credibility, and honestly, it just makes you look more professional. So why mess it up? Squarespace offers an easy way to find a domain that works for you or your business. They even host it for you, all in one place. So if you've been thinking about getting a domain for your new project or personal site, go to squarespace.com and enter the offer code HIGH-RESOLUTION, that's one word, to get 10% off your first purchase. Make your next move with Squarespace. We'd also like to thank our friends at InVision for their support. InVision is the world's leading product design platform, powering the future of digital design through their understanding of the importance of collaboration. They're used by some of the most innovative companies in the world, like Facebook, Capital One, Netflix, and Airbnb. I work with remote teams all the time, and I found that keeping a healthy dialogue is really important. Without it, building strong work relationships gets a lot harder, and that leads to poor collaboration. I've also found that prototypes are a great way for me to show my full vision for a design, and this helps cut down a lot of back and forth. InVision makes all of this really easy. You can rapidly prototype your designs and collaborate across every stage of your project, taking your ideas from concept to code. It simplifies virtually every aspect of the design workflow and makes collaboration a core part of the process for everyone, from project managers to designers, developers, and writers. Teams that build digital products are at a serious advantage when they use InVision's suite of prototyping and collaboration tools. It's the best way to get everyone on board. Visit InVisionApp.com/high-resolution for 3 months free.
Tell us what the design sprint is.
So our team, I work with, at Google Ventures. So we, invest in quite a few companies, about 300 odd companies at this point, across a huge range of industries. And, hey, Ursula. We brought a guy onto our team, Jake Knapp, who had been running design sprints at Google, and he had been kind of trying to find a way to help teams move more quickly at a big company. And Braden Kowitz, who's one of the other designers on my team, had seen what Jake was doing and was like, I think that would apply extremely well to startups. So Jake's been working on this idea of creating a 5-day process for testing and validating big ideas. And we've all been doing a lot of sprints, something like 120 sprints at this point, with portfolio companies. And it's coming back to these ideas that we were talking about earlier about the scientific method of business. I think the real value of a sprint is to look at a big problem and then go and be able to look at patterns of how people solve similar things before, do ideation in a really healthy way, instead of this typical bullshit brainstorming process, to kind of bring out the best of everyone's expertise in the room, is to do ideation, do a healthy decision-making process about which ideas have the most potential, do rapid prototyping, so we prototype in a single day, fairly complex prototypes in a single day, and then we go and test with 5 customers. So it's this very, it's a bit structured. I know it sounds a bit bullshit consultancy, but we found it to be an extremely effective way of helping teams who are in kind of deep production mode all the time to stop, look at the big picture, measure kind of like where the biggest potential or the biggest risks are to their team, do a little bit of measurement. Are we headed in the right direction? Is there a potential product we could build here or a change we can make? Measure whether or not that's a good idea, and then go into their typical development cycle.
After reading the book, I've tried it a few times. It worked really well. The thing that stood out to me is, in order for the design sprint to work, you need to know what the problem is that you're trying to solve. I'm very curious what you do to problem find before you go into the sprint, or what are these startups that you work with? What did they do to find problems before you go into the sprint?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question. It's one of the biggest risks to a sprint is if you're not working on the right problem, you're not likely to be successful in the end. And when I mean successful, I mean like, are you going to ship a successful product? The way that we help teams evaluate problems is actually surprisingly simple. You would think that sometimes we get really sophisticated and go do a bunch of user research first and really try to identify where the problems are. So like the master class, if you've got a full-time researcher on your team, is to go deep on research to really kind of know the problem space extremely well. But we don't always do that. More frequently, the way it works is that maybe 2 weeks, 3 weeks before a sprint, so we kind of are planning the sprint already, like blocking off time in our calendars. And then 2 or 3 weeks before the sprint, we'll sit down with leadership, CEO, head of product, basically the people who are really driving the roadmap and the decisions in the company. And we'll ask them, what are your OKRs? What are the big things that are keeping you up at night? Where are the biggest risks or the biggest potential opportunities in your business where you've got questions around them? Right? And usually, risk is huge questions, right? Like if we do this thing, we've got this product idea, but if no one likes it, we'll fail. Or if our current user base, throws up on it, we'll go out of business. Or, there's usually those types of risks. And then there's also these ideas of potential, like this, if we swing for the fences and make this thing, like that could be amazing for our business, but we're not likely to do it because it would be a big investment of our time. Right? So those types of questions, and we're usually operating on a very tight time schedule. We're not doing blue sky thinking. I've seen a lot of teams try to apply sprints to like, what does the future look like? It's not particularly useful for that. I wouldn't use it for that. I'd more look 6 months out. Like, what are you hoping to ship in 6 months, and where's the big risk in that? Or what are the ideas that have been floating around that have never really been tried because they're too risky? And maybe consider prototyping those things you might actually do. It's quite good for this type of pragmatic product roadmap, kind of opportunity analysis, I guess.
The key is to ship. That like you don't the whole point of not doing blue sky thinking and doing a 6-month timeline to ship is that you want to build something that gets out into the world.
I mean, we are investors. So I work at a venture capital firm. Yeah. The businesses that we invest in, we are hoping that they will be successful as businesses, and that the quickest path to there is by making good decisions, every few months when they make their big bets. And so. It might be a bit different if you work at a massive company where you're thinking much more. If you've got a resident futurist on staff, like maybe you're thinking differently, and maybe you can be more creative in how you apply a sprint. But for us, we're very pragmatic about it. When we measure the success of a sprint, it's did we get enough data to make a good decision, and 6 months later when we ship the product, did we get similar results to what we anticipated from the sprint? If the product never ships, I consider the sprint to be if a good idea from the sprint never ships, I would consider that to be a failure of the sprint. Maybe we didn't focus on the right thing, or we didn't convince the right people that, a good idea was a good idea. So yeah, very, very like hard-nosed about why we use a sprint. And another good way to look at it maybe about choosing the right problem is, one of my colleagues has this, he loves saying the phrase, start at the end, right? And so in a concrete way, what he really means is, if you come up with an idea, here's a problem space we're considering, and if 5 users came in and they all said X about it, what would we do? If you can't answer that question before you start the sprint, you're probably doing the wrong thing, right? Because what you're really saying is 5 users of this type, if we can get 5 sports fans to come in and they all say that this concept is great, that this is better than the thing we had before, and we go and ship it, that'll be good for our business. If you can't say that confidently, don't work on that problem. Yeah.
So business leaders, some business leaders and designers have a compulsion to jump to the first solution without any proper vetting. Yeah. And one of the things I really like about Design Sprint is this emphasis on exploring multiple ideas and then focusing in once you have some sort of validation, right? Now, some designers are lucky enough to work on teams where they've at least heard of the concept or heard of something similar, and getting people to buy into this concept, especially non-designers, is not that hard. But I assume that more often than not, that's not the case, right? So what are some ways, very simple things that a designer can do if they actually want to decide to do this thing to get buy-in from these non-designers?
Sure. So if you want to get buy-in, the first thing I wouldn't do is try to pitch somebody on doing a 5-day consultancy style project. Because even the startups I work with, getting 5 days with 6 or 7 people in a room seems wasteful. So I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't call it a sprint. I wouldn't call it, I would kind of avoid any of the things that sound like you're kind of doing a process. The first thing I would do to build credibility is just to start prototyping. It's not going to be perfect, but if you can go and take your CEO's idea or your head of product's idea and prototype it and then get it in front of customers and come back with that evidence to that person, you'll start building credibility with at least one person. You're like, hey, here's the value of user research because I went and did it. And maybe it's going rogue and doing some, kind of gutsy, scrappy guerrilla research on the weekend, which, I'm not going to recommend as your long-term solution. But as a first step to just building credibility and even just building your muscles of doing prototyping and research, that's a really good first step. And to your point of the value of sprints is trying more than one idea, potentially prototype their idea and prototype another version. We do this a lot where we'll do kind of head-to-head comparison of things, and we'll just slap on kind of fake brands onto things. Just call it Omni Finance and Dollar Tree or something. That's a real company.
That's right.
Dollar Plan.
Not a sponsor. Not a sponsor.
Is that like a dollar store?
Yeah, Dollar Tree is a dollar store. Yeah.
But anyway, come up with two separate brands for them both that aren't your brand, and go and test them with customers. Ideally, come back with a little bit of video or something so they can see a real customer actually using their product. Because you have to be a real cold-hearted jerk not to watch a real customer stumble on your idea and still think it's a good idea. But kind of low investment. Don't expect them to read a big report. Do kind of bullet point analysis. And use that to build your credibility, and then be potentially start using some of the other techniques that we use in sprints. Stuff like the next time you run a meeting, do dot voting, for instance, when you're trying to solve a problem. Which is if you're trying to come up with kind of, say you're working on an identity and you're trying to come up with the values for your company. Everyone sits around in a meeting and just starts shouting out stuff, and it's really frustrating and really inefficient and lets the loudest voices win. It's a really dysfunctional way to run a meeting. Have everyone write down their things on a piece of paper. What are the values for our company? Write them all on the whiteboard, with little numbers next to them, and then you get 5 votes. Vote on the ones you think are the most appropriate. All of a sudden, you get this nice heat map that actually takes everyone's real intellectual ability. You've actually thought about it, you've considered all of the options, and you make a decision. Bring a technique like that to a meeting, that's successful. Do something like quiet ideation. I was just talking to a designer the other day, and she said whenever she runs a meeting, all the engineers start yelling out ideas, and nobody ever lands on anything. And I was like, oh, you're kind of doing it wrong. Like, really give everybody a piece of paper or some Post-it notes and get everybody quietly for 15 minutes just to write down their, try to draw their concept. It doesn't have to be, doesn't have to look like Leonardo da Vinci, but it's amazing when you think of how much time you spent in a company, how few times you've had 15 minutes of quiet time to actually put a little bit of form around your idea and then try to express it to everybody else. It's like you start taking some of these things and people will start noticing that they're effective and that their old way of working is a bit dysfunctional. And then you'll be like, listen, like the master class for this is doing something like a sprint. There are other processes too, but a sprint's a good way to do this. And then, potentially you can get everybody to do it maybe even as like a, team building experiment kind of thing. Just make sure you work on a real problem. And then once they've seen it once, hopefully you've built up the credibility to go and do it on a regular basis.
So if I was to tease away the big takeaway here, it's don't start with jargony words. Don't try and sell an entire sprint and piecemeal it while showing them progress along the way. So maybe you take the prototyping day and you do it yourself, or you take the dot voting day and you do it with a few people. And then eventually you build enough credibility to show them this is the process actually should be 5 days and you need to be in the room for a few of these days. And then that's how you get the people back into the mindset of wanting to do these design sprints.
That's a good summary, yeah.
Okay. What kind of problem is a bad problem to solve in the design sprint?
One of the things I've seen that teams, there are kind of two classes of problems I've seen that teams sometimes gravitate towards that are generally not good problems for sprints. One is your typical design problem, right? Like when we get approached by teams, they're often thinking, we used to call them design sprints all the time. And so the minute they hear the word design, they're like, oh, we'll solve our interface problems. And you're like, yeah, I can help you solve interface problems. Like I'm a pretty good interface designer, but like the real meat here is solving your business problems. Like, big product challenges, big like pricing problems, stuff like, conversion funnels, stuff that's like really core to the business. So make sure you're not working on just solving usability problems. There's, doing usability testing is great. You should do lots of usability testing. I wouldn't use 5 days to do that. I would make, it's kind of later in the production cycle. Do some production work, do some research. Very, very useful, but not necessarily a 5-day project. And the other one is to avoid really blue sky thinking. I think the teams, designers in particular, are, I think a lot of designers learned in art school that if you're not working on like deep conceptual work, that you're kind of not doing it right, and that they kind of jump from. I've seen lots of teams that are focused right on production, right, and then it's almost like they kind of over counter that by instead of working on strategic work, they go all the way to like conceptual. And they're just like, whoa, what if the world was completely different? Like, what if cars didn't have to have their wheels on the road? Like, it could be totally different. Right. Yeah. And like, that's fun. Like, don't get me wrong, I like, ideating about like, moon bases too. But it's not measurable in a way that a sprint is really helpful with. So if you can't kind of figure out how you would measure the success of something, it's probably not a great use of a sprint. Some ad agencies I've met with. I met with a big ad agency a couple years ago, and they were like, "Oh, we want to do sprints for this project." And I was like, "Oh, what's your project?" And they're like, "Oh, it's a microsite for this big beer brand." And I'm like, "Well, what's successful about the microsite?" And they're like, "Well, impressions." And I'm like, "How are you going to measure impressions in a user study? Like, a microsite's like it's not a functional thing. It's just like loose brand experience thing." Obviously you can see what I think of microsites, but we're much more frequently doing things where it's a bit more functional.
So while we're on the topic of measurable outcomes, walk us through your process for testing at the end of these sprints, right? Like who chooses these people, and what's your preferred mode of testing?
So what we're doing in a design sprint is almost always doing 5 one-on-one studies. So this isn't like some focus group bullshit or whatever. But it's a pretty small group of people, right? So we do 5 studies. It's enough to give you credible evidence, and it's the kind of the maximum number of people we can do in one day with one researcher. And so what we do is on the first day of the sprint, we're kind of figuring out the problem space that we're going to be working in. And on the Monday, we're already figuring out like who are we going to have to do the study with? Like who, it's usually either, this larger audience that if we can solve for, like we'll know that we have a big enough group, or something like is it early adopters, and even if we can't even get them to pick it up, like we know we're really screwed. That's a big generalization, but we think of it like that often. And so we'll think about whichever company it is, like who represents that group, and how can you like what are the red flags that would indicate someone's not appropriate, right? So if we're working with oncologists, you have to figure out like, okay, if they work in community oncology, great. If they work at a research hospital, like that things are totally different at a research hospital. We wouldn't work with, their feedback wouldn't be helpful. Or, in a really simplistic way, like we work with Blue Bottle Coffee. If you're just a tea drinker, like, yeah, I'm not going to pick you. If you roast your own beans, you're probably not appropriate for our study either. We're looking for somebody who, buys coffee, has bought something that's not Folgers before, maybe isn't that familiar with Blue Bottle, right? So what we do is, and this is again extremely generalized. There are some articles on our website if you're really serious about getting into this. But what we do is we put out a survey. So if it's a consumer thing, we'll put it out in Craigslist a lot of the time if we're working in the United States. And it's like we'll pay you $100 to come do a user study. If you're interested, please fill out this form. And the form, the survey, has a bunch of questions buried in it. So we wouldn't ask, like, if we're doing a study for Blue Bottle Coffee, the first question isn't, do you drink coffee? It's like, what is your, what do you have for breakfast in the morning? And we'd list, 15 things. And if they check coffee, like, cool, we know they're a coffee drinker. Because you just want to bury the lead a little bit so you don't get people who are just trying to get their $100. Yeah. We'll have a bunch of questions like that down the list. So we're selective, fairly selective, because a good way to think about it is if a user who looked like X came in and said something strong about what we're doing, like, would you just dismiss it? Yeah. Right? Because that's a big risk in doing a sprint, is if you don't have the right users in the room, leaders, like strong personalities in the room will sometimes dismiss the results of the sprint. So like, oh, we did this, but like, the oncologists we had in there, none of them were Ivy League. And you're like, oh, well, it turns out Ivy League is important. Like, we should have recruited for that. Like, where did you get your degree from? I'm just pulling examples out of my butt here. But you want to think of it that way. Like, who would we need to hear from to know if this is going to be successful, and then figure out like a simple survey to do this. So we put it out there on Monday. We commit already that they're going to come in on Friday, so it kind of lights a fire under us. And so it's a little. I mean, the first few times you do this, it's a little scary because like you barely know the problem space. You've already invited 5 people to come in. We have no idea what solution we're going to make, let alone like what form the prototype is going to take. Now you got to get something done in 4 days in order to have something ready for 9 a.m. on Friday.
And let's say we get to Friday and we test, and the results are a failure. I hesitate to use that word because I don't necessarily know what that means in this instant. But let's say we didn't meet the goals of the sprint.
Yeah.
How do you help the business people and other designers here contend with maybe a shaky confidence issue, right? So if the sprint fails them for some reason, or they weren't able to complete the prototypes in time or whatever, like how do you help them get past the hump and say, listen, we got to try this again. Here's what we missed.
Okay, let's define failure. Because I think of it, when we do a sprint and all 5 customers hate the prototype, that's not a failure. That's we learned a lot, right? Sure. It's like you either, somebody said you either win or you learn about a sprint. So I wouldn't consider that to be a failure. Okay. That's you just learn something about your users. You learn that idea you're about to commit 3 months of engineering to is not a good idea. Okay, let's come up with more ideas and do this again, right? And I would consider that to be a huge win, right? It would have been a massive waste of effort and money to go and pursue that idea. Where design sprints aren't successful, people don't believe the results, or you didn't finish the prototype. It's hard for me to talk about this because we've done it enough times that we're generally successful in that we finished the sprint and got credible results. I have talked to some really senior designers who I respect, and they're like, "Oh, you guys are cheating because you guys are really good, and of course you can finish a prototype in one day." And I'm like, "Oh, not really. Don't get me wrong, I'm a pretty good designer. I've made a lot of interfaces, but a lot of it is about, the one day for doing a prototype isn't about being the best designer in the world. It's about prioritizing. What are you actually trying to learn? And it's certainly not will people click on this button if it looks perfect? It's if we have a button and it's got this text on it, will anybody understand what the hell is going on here is more likely what you're really trying to learn. So we're often working in these kind of mid-fidelity tools. So, working Keynote or Sketch, but just using some basic templates, not outlines. It looks like an interface, but doesn't look like the best interface you've ever seen. Yeah. You don't want to work in this fidelity where it looks like a wireframe. Because when your customers come in, you want them to think it's a real website. Yeah. But I think every visual designer should do some sprints and do more user studies and realize how little visual design can paper over a bad idea. Yeah. Don't get me wrong. Visual design, exquisite visual design has a place, but make sure you're making the right thing first. Because, we did a video, for instance, with Slack when we were helping them with their out-of-box experience. We shot that typical video on a homepage that explains the product. We shot one of those in a single day, along with doing the rest of the prototype. And, sure, we've got a videographer on our team, and, he's got a nice DSLR. But, we spent 3/4 of the day writing a decent script, set up the camera, and one of my colleagues actually pretended he was Stuart Butterfield, who's the CEO of Slack, and he goes, "Hi, I'm Stuart Butterfield. I'm sick of email. Aren't you sick of email too?" That's great. And it was really funny. But of course, none of the customers knew. Yeah. They don't know who Stuart is. They'd never heard of Slack. And to them, it was just a promotional video. They didn't know this was made in a single day. And it certainly didn't have the polish that I'm sure your video team would put on it, if they had weeks. But we learned very clearly which messages resonated with them in that video and which ones didn't. And now if we went and made a real video, we'd be able to invest our time in the right places. So I think, where you see teams fall down, it's usually about prioritization and making sure you're working on the right problem, making sure that something like the prototype is actually focused on answering those questions that you had at the beginning of the sprint, as opposed to looking like a production prototype. Sure. You're prototyping to answer questions. You're not prototyping to win any design award.
Yeah, this isn't Dribble.
Yeah, no doubt.
This is
pretty far away from Dribble. Yeah.
We need to move to community questions next, but before we do that, I actually have a personal question for you. You're spending all of your time now between companies that Google Ventures has invested in, which means you're context switching week to week. You're solving different problems every single week. Do you miss solving a single problem for a single product?
Yeah. I definitely do. I feel more and more. I've been doing this for 4 years now at GV. And before that, I co-founded, a couple of companies, and what I really miss is owning the problems. It's really fun to jump in and help other people solve their problems, but there's a gravity to solving your own problems where it really matters to you, and don't get me wrong, I'm we invest in these companies and I'm personally invested in their success, so I take it very seriously. But when it's your problem to solve, and when you're the one who's going to not just have to ideate, but to actually ship the thing and then measure the results and kind of sink or swim with them, that's fun. I mean, it's stressful. I don't forget how hard it was to run a business. But that stress is, I miss that energy a little bit. Yeah, for sure. It's hard. I mean, it's really hard.
Do you do side projects or anything to like keep yourself afloat here? Like what?
Yeah, I hacked on like a little project with my brother last year.
Oh, that's awesome.
My twin brother,
That's
he's
great.
an engineer. And Kevin Rose and I recently collaborated with a friend of his, Caleb, on a fasting app. Awesome. But they're a little dinky, I miss a bit working on like a big, hard, kind of multifaceted, long-term problem. Like running startups is fun.
Yeah, it is. It's addicting.
I mean, it's heart attack inducing, but it's fun.
All right, we're going to move to community questions next. Basically, here's what we've done. We reached out to the community and we asked them what questions are kind of burning up inside them. What's the stuff that they're thinking about right now? We picked 5 questions, and we will start with the first question. How do you explain the role of design to people in your business?
Oh, boy. I have a weird business.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I work in a, several billion-dollar venture capital company. Yeah. It's weird for us because on the one hand, I don't do as much design work for GV. I'm mostly outward-facing, working with our portfolio companies. I design our website and like help design our identity and stuff like kind of the obvious things that normal designers do. But most of my time spent kind of doing consultancy, and there's no junior designers on our team. Like we're all a bunch of old farts. Seasoned. Yeah, that's a polite way of putting it. But we've all been, designing for 15, 20 years. So, we kind of get some built-in credibility, which is nice. It's like, hey, you did that thing I've heard of, maybe you can do that thing without a lot of oversight. So it's not like I have a manager who I've got to convince of the value all the time. But we do try to look for ways to measure kind of whether or not we're being successful. And the biggest measure of our success is, are we helping companies become worth more money? It's very, capitalistic in a lot of ways. It's a venture capital company. So we do measure ourselves largely on, do teams make better hiring decisions, and do they make better product decisions that actually ship and go out in the wild and are successful? So we do try to kind of draw a line from my involvement with a company through to whether or not they made some successful decisions. But it's a little more amorphous than some companies might be about explaining design. And it really bleeds into product a lot in the way we work. Yeah.
So the other question we've been asking people is how their design teams are organized, but you're at a VC fund, so this is a little bit different. But you're a design partner. So how do you and the other design partners actually work together at GV?
That's a great question. So we've got a team. It's a bunch of designers. 4 designers and a full-time researcher and a design producer. So our design producer is helping kind of coordinate everything and make sure we're kind of making the best use of our time. Our researcher focuses primarily on research. So he's going off and either coaching researchers in the portfolio or does quite a bit of hands-on research with portfolio companies. And then the rest of us are all, we're all like kind of multifaceted product designers. And it's been kind of interesting because we can all kind of jump in and out of doing kind of interface type work, because we've all done quite a bit of it. But we each have kind of our own kind of superpowers. And so we try to kind of focus ourselves, so I probably spend 30% of my time working on kind of things I specifically can do with the portfolio. So I have a lot more identity experience, for instance, and branding experience than the rest of the designers on our team. So I've kind of made that a bit more of a focus of mine since joining the team, which has been fun because I never would have really called myself a brand designer before coming to GV, and now I feel like I've had the time to kind of create a bit of a process around it, so I feel more confident at it. One of our other designers is more focused on writing, and he was a really, really good copywriter. So that's his primary focus. Braden's been lately focusing on what it takes to build great design teams and great design culture. So he's focused on that. The nice thing is like because we focus on these things, we can kind of bring back what we've figured out to the rest of the team. We're all still growing as designers, and that's when you talk to designers about kind of what they get out of their jobs. And I get to talk to probably a couple hundred designers a year about this. It's really interesting that beyond the money and influence, like one of the biggest things people are looking for is growth. And it's really cool that after 20 years of doing design, still lots of opportunity to learn on this team.
So think back to a time when you were less seasoned, less well known, had a shorter portfolio of work to show. If you're the only designer in a company and your job is to own design, how do you convince the business leaders that design matters?
Whew. Yeah, it's a hard one. How would I convince business leaders that design matters? A lot of it is about speaking their language, right? Business leaders don't think in terms of aesthetics. They don't think in terms of this looks better than it did before. They don't even think in terms of interfaces or even usability all the time, this is easier for our customers to use. They think in terms of sales numbers, conversion metrics, these kind of fairly hard goals, right? Can we bring on more clients? Can we grow our user base? Can we, sell more widgets? So in many ways, I would think to build your credibility, and don't get me wrong, it's not the only language of design, because I do think aesthetic and the harder to explain parts of design are still important. They're just harder to measure. But I would to build your credibility, focus on the measurable parts of design, things that are closer to product level. Conversion metrics, like improving the numbers on a specific feature of your product, and figure out the design that actually gets you there. And then you can start getting into the harder to explain things. Stuff like product quality, design quality, fit and finish. These things matter a lot to designers, right? And they should. They're really hard to explain to somebody. And again, instead of just focusing on, well, this needs to look better, you have to focus on things like talking about it in terms of brand. And we want to build credibility with our users over the long term. The more loose edges there are in our product, the less we will, over time, it will be death by 1,000 cuts, that people will no longer believe that we build credible software, and they won't believe in our engineering because on the surface, the shingles are falling off the house, right? That's actually a pretty good analogy. Come up with stories like that if you want to convince somebody that the logo needs to be tweaked or the colors aren't right. These things to avoid getting into the 40 shades of blue kind of measurement stuff. Yeah.
How do you measure and present design results to people in your business?
How do we present and measure design results? For us, it's very business driven. Yeah. I'm sure I'm starting to sound like a broken record a little bit, but when we think about the results, it's things like, externally working with companies, did the decision we helped them make, 6 months ago result in a big product change that, they either got good press about, changed metrics, changed their business, helped them figure out a pricing model problem. We can point to these things and say, hey, 6 months ago we worked with the CEO, this was their biggest problem. They just, made this big change and it worked out predictably as we imagined. That's a big success for us. Some of the other stuff we do is like building the credibility of GV as a business. So that's part of the reason we speak at conferences or write articles, or we partly do it because it's just a good thing to do for the community. We partly do it because it's good for GV to have that kind of role. We can again look at kind of where did we get noticed? Where did how did that influence whether or not people came in for being able to recruit them into startups? A designer had heard of us, got in touch. We managed to place them at a startup in a critical role. Those types of things are really core to GV's success as a venture firm.
So we can end with this last one. as the purpose of design continues to evolve, what are some roles and methodologies that you think might start to emerge over the next 5 years?
I like your time frame. 5 years is the future, but not the distant future. I think if designers don't squander the opportunity, I think the chance for design to work at the business level is very good. And I think the advent of we're kind of in the golden age of prototyping tools right now. I mean, all of a sudden we went from everything taking a long time or having to be in code, or we've got all these great tools available to us now. I think if we go and apply those in the right places, all of a sudden design's been clamoring for the seat at the table for so long, and it worries me that a lot of designers kind of got the opportunity. Like the founders believed in this pixie dust called design, but they don't really know what the value is. And if you ask them, they'll ask you to do design, right? And I think great designers have this opportunity over the next 5 years to really fundamentally help businesses make better decisions faster. And if they don't squander that opportunity by working on the wrong things, or by not asking the right questions, or by not having the humility to go out and find answers as opposed to just thinking they're geniuses who can come up with solutions, I think design all of a sudden has this chance to really be a core function that businesses just think oh, of course I need design because how else would I know where I'm going?
Right.
I really hope designers can do that.
I hope so too. Cool. Well, thanks so much, Daniel. This was fun.
It's great seeing you guys.
Hey, you made it to the end. Congratulations. Thanks for watching the episode. I really, really hope you liked it. If you did like it, please leave us a review on the iTunes store. And by the way, if you have any questions that came up because of the content that we covered with our guests, go on YouTube, go on Twitter. You can tweet us, you can leave us a comment. We'll get back to you. We'll help you as much as possible. @HighRes Podcast. That's the screen name or the handle for Twitter, for Instagram, for Facebook. Find us, talk to us. We want to converse with you. We're not going to leave here, by the way, without also thanking our friends at Searle Video. They've been an amazing partner on this entire project. So Searle Video is a creative studio based out of Portland, Oregon. They've helped creative communities tell stories for over 10 years. They've done advertisements, behind the scene footage, and documentaries for companies like Google, Slack, XOXO Festival, Adobe, Intel. They're incredible. They've traveled with us through the entire country documenting these stories with our guests. That's incredible. Thank you so much, Searle. Listen, if you're a startup looking to elevate your product, if you're a big company looking to humanize your brand, if you're someone in the creative community who just wants to tell a story, you've got to check out the team at Searle Video. It's searlevideo.com, SEARLE video.com. Check out our friends at Searle. Thank you so much, guys. You guys have been incredible on this project.